The Mythology of All Races, Volume 2, Eddic, Chapter 5, The Greater Gods, Thor. The name of the god Thor of the Eddas occurs elsewhere in the following forms: Donar, Thonair, Thonor, and, in the speech of the Normans, Thur. These are from an earlier Thonaras, and the root is connected with Indo-Germanic ten, to boom, to roar. Donar Thor is thus the loud sounder, the thunderer, the thunder god, the earliest aspect of this deity. His widespread cult is attested by the equally widespread name of the fifth day of the week over the Teutonic era, Donarestag or Thonirestag, Thonoresdag, Thunresdag, hence Thursday, Swedish Thursday, Danish Torsdag. The names were equivalents of the Roman Dies Jovis, and this suggests that Donar was regarded as the Teutonic Jupiter. In the early part of the 8th century, S. Boniface found the Hessians at Geismar revering a huge sacred oak, Robur Jovis, which he began to cut down when the wind completed his efforts. Boniface denounced the cult of such demons as Jupiter and spoke of Christian priests who sacrificed to Jupiter, feasting on the sacrifice. Jupiter is undoubtedly Thor. The Indiculus Superstitionum, 8th century, speaks of the Saxon Sacra Jovis and Feriae Jovis, and Thonair was one of the gods whom Saxon renounced at baptism. The 8th century Homilia de Sacrilegis, probably written by a priest of the northern part of the Frankish kingdom, says that no work was done on the day of Jupiter, and earlier notices of this ritual idleness occur in Caesarius of Arles, 5th century, and Eligius of Troyes, 588 to 659 AD, both referring to customs of the Germanic inhabitants of these regions. German penitential bearing the names Corrector and Medicus, which forms the 19th book of the collection of decrees made by Burchard of Worms around 1000 AD, and which was itself compiled in the early 10th century, also speaks of the observance of the fifth day in honor of Jupiter. Saxo had difficulty in accepting the equivalence of Thor as Jupiter and Odin as Mercury, for this would make Jupiter son of Mercury, since Thor was Odin's son. He concludes that, if Jupiter was father of Mercury, Thor could not be Jupiter, nor Odin Mercury. The identification of Thor with Jupiter was apparently subsequent to his equivalence with Hercules as the Interpretatio Romana. Tacitus places Hercules next to Mercury among the German tribes, and Hercules with his club is plainly the same as Thor with his hammer. Both were strong, both fought against evil powers. Hercules also occurs in inscriptions in Batavian territory, Hercules Magusnaus, and in the lower Rhine region, where dedications to a Germanic Hercules occur. Magusanus, the strong, from an old German Magen, to be strong, is connected with the name of Thor's son Magni, and corresponds to a Norse epithet of Thor's, Hin Rami, the strong. A Hercules Diosoniasis, named on coins, is presumed to be a native German god, the name appearing in such place names as Duisburg. Hercules Barbatus on Rhenish inscriptions is also Donar, whose bed is often mentioned in Norse literature. Hercules Maliator, in an inscription at Obernburg, refers to Donar with his hammer. Tacitus speaks of the Germanic Hercules and Mars being placated with the permissible animal victims. They tell how Hercules appeared among them, and on the eve of battle, the hymn the first of all brave men. Arminius convened the tribes in a wood sacred to Hercules, a cult center of the Cherusci and other tribes east of the Weser. Donar Thor, the thunder god, thus corresponds to Jupiter, in whose hands are thunder and lightning, and, as the strongest of the gods with his hammer, to Hercules, the strong hero with his club. If the Teutons known to the Romans told myths about Donar conquering giants and monsters, like the Norse Thor, the equivalence with Hercules is intelligible. Apart from the occurrence of Donar's name in that of the 5th day of the week, we find it on the Nordendorf brooch, discovered in Alemannic territory and belonging to the 7th century, joined with that of Odin in a runic inscription. The meaning of this seems to be that Thonar and Wodan are asked to consecrate a marriage. Thonar the Mighty is named in a 12th century manuscript in a charm against epilepsy. The witness of mountain names in Germany is significant. Donnersberg, or Thonersberg, Thunnersberg, and others, like the Thorsbjorg in Norway. Among the Anglo-Saxons, the name Thonar does not occur in the royal genealogies as does that of Woden, but his frequent appearance in English place names points to his cult. Saxo speaks of Thor among the Danes as a god, to the greatness of whose force nothing human or divine could fitly be compared. He, Odin, and many others, being once men skilled in magic, claimed the rank of gods, and ensnared the people of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. For Thor's cult and popularity in Sweden, we have the witness of Adam of Bremen, who equates Thor with the scepter with Jupiter, and describes him as most powerful of the gods there. He is ruler of the air, controls lightning and thunder, winds, rainstorms, fine weather, and crops. Saxo also speaks of him as the great Thor of Sweden. Above all, Norway was the region where the cult of Thor was most popular and long existent. In Norway and in Iceland after its colonization, and to some extent in Sweden, Thor appears as the chief god, whose sovereignty Odin had taken. His cult was popular. His images are often mentioned. Where his image stood beside those of other deities, it had the most prominent place or was the most richly decked. At Trondheim, in the chief temple, Thor sat in the midst as the most honorable, his image large and decked with gold and silver. He sat in his wagon, very magnificent, drawn by 2 goats carved in wood, with horns covered with silver. The whole was mounted on wheels. His image with his hammer was carved on the pillars of high seats belonging to heads of families, or on the backs of chairs, or on the sterns of ships. Carved in bone, it was used as a protective amulet. Men carried his images with them, made of silver or ivory. Many temples of Thor existed in Norway and Iceland, and are mentioned in the sagas and other writings. No other god had so many temples there as Thor. Thor's name was common in personal and place names in Scandinavia. Thordis, Thorkel, Thorgerd, Thorstein, and innumerable others, and the proportion is large compared with those of other deities, Odin's name occurring seldom in Norse names. Among the Icelandic colonists of the 9th and 10th centuries, names compounded of Thor are 51 as compared with 3 of Frey and none of Odin. On monuments with runes, Thor is besought to consecrate these, and they sometimes have the form of his hammer. The thing or assembly was opened on Thor's day, in a place consecrated to Thor, showing that he was associated with law and justice. His superiority is seen in epithets bestowed upon him. Asabragar, first of the Aesir. Landas, god of the country. Hofdingi Alra Goda, chief of all gods. Mest Dignadr, most honored. He is Midgard's warder, the mighty one of the gods. At law business, oaths were taken with the words, "So help me Frey and Njord and the Almighty God," that is, Thor. It is significant that Odin's name does not occur in this formula. The reasons for Odin's later supremacy have already been discussed. Thor's supremacy, however, was never forgotten, and to the end he remained chief god to the peasants and yeomen. The Icelandic colonists believed that they were under his protection and guided by him to their new abodes, which they called after him. The images of Thor and Frey are often mentioned in Iceland, Odin's but once. Apart from the king's sacrifice to Odin, sacrifices were made only to Thor and Frey. Thor consecrates runes, not Odin, and the thing met on his day, not Odin's. The lines already cited from Harbardsljóð show that the warrior aristocracy went to Odin at death, the folk to Thor, and the statement is significant of the relative position of the two gods at the time when the poem was composed, 10th century. The poem might be viewed as an attempt of its author to emphasize Odin's greatness at the expense of Thor's. While this is possible, yet the poem illustrates the lower aspects of Odin, his rumors and magic, and it might equally be regarded as the comment of a mocking half-believer upon the gods. The poem is a contest of wits between Thor and Odin, disguised as a ferryman, Harbard. Thor appears as a peasant with a basket on his back, coming back from a journey to the east. He asks Harbard to bring his boat over, but Harbard inquires what sort of peasant is this, and twits him with his lowly position, not even possessing the usual peasant's farm, barefoot and in a peasant's dress. What is his name? "I am Odin's son, the strong one of the gods," Thor replies, and threatens Harbard for his mockery. The two then relate their adventures, each bidding the other tell what he was doing at the time. Thor's adventures are the slaying of the giants Hrungnir and Thjazi, and of evil giant women. His compelling the sons of Svarang to sue for peace. His slaying the evil brides of the berserkers. Odin recounts his love affairs and his causing of wars, and taunts Thor with cowardice, betraying troth, slaying women, and with Sif's infidelity. Thor reproaches Harbard with repaying good gifts with evil mind, calls him womanish, utters foul speech against him, and threatens him with death if he could cross the water to him. Harbard still refuses to ferry him over, and adds that he never thought that Asa Thor, Thor of the Aesir, would be hindered by a ferryman. Finally, he bids him take his way on foot and directs him how to go. Thor says that Harbard is speaking in mockery, and then the latter tells him to go hence where every evil thing will harm him. Odin's contempt for Thor in this poem mirrors the relation of the higher classes with their cult of Odin to the people outside the courtly and aristocratic circles to whom Thor was still the chief god. Thor's supremacy is attested in Lokasenna, for he alone of the gods can silence Loki. He saves the gods from the vengeance of giants according to other myths, or, as the poets, Thorbjorn sings, "Bravely fought Thor for Asgard and the followers of Odin." The opposition between Thor and Odin appears in an episode of the life of the ideal Danish and Norse hero Stargard. He had been nourished by Odin, called Roshars Grani, horsehair bed. Becoming one of King Vikar's companions, he was with him when his fleet was stayed by a storm, and when the Lord showed that Vikar himself must be sacrificed to Odin. That night Odin called Starkad and took him to a wood, where, in a clearing, 11 men were sitting on as many seats. The 12th seat was empty. Odin sat on it, and was hailed by the others as Odin. The occasion had now come for Starkad's fate to be pronounced. Thor said that as his mother had chosen a giant for his father instead of Thor, Starkad would have neither son nor daughter. Odin then said that he would live for 3 generations. In each, Thor said, he would do a dastard's deed. Odin announced that he would have the best of weapons and armor. Thor replied that he would have neither lands nor heritage. Odin promised him many possessions. Thor asserted that still he would always long for more. Odin promised him victory in every fight. Thor said that he would always receive terrible wounds. Odin announced that he would give him such a gift of poetry that verse would flow from his lips like common speech. Thor said that he would forget all his poems. Odin declared that the bravest and noblest would honor him. Thor said that the common people would hate him. These different fates were endorsed by the others. Odin finally said that Starkad must repay him by slaying Vikar, and gave him instructions how to effect this, as has already been told. Thor appears in the story as opponent of the aristocratic warrior class dear to Odin, and of their ideals, turning every gift of Odin's into a curse or neutralizing it, and thus acting the part of the third Norn in some tales. In the Eddas, Thor is regarded as son of Odin, but this could only have been a mythic convention resulting from Odin's growing supremacy and the desire to bring all other deities into relation with him. This mythic relationship is asserted in the Old English homily written by Aelfric, who says that the Danes held Jupiter, whom they call Thor, to be son of Mercury, called by them Odin. This he regards as erroneous according to Roman mythology. Saxo, as has been seen, was also puzzled by the equation. Thor's mother is Jord, Earth. His wife is Sif, the fair-haired goddess, with hair like gold, who was accused by Loki and by Odin of unfaithfulness to him. Thor himself was not faithful to her. Their daughter is Thrud, or Might, promised by the gods to Alvis in Thor's absence. Thor is sometimes described as Thrud's father. Hence, she may be regarded as a personification of his might. He himself is Thrudgr, the mighty, and Thrudvald, strong protector. His hammer is Thrudhammer, or mighty hammer. His dwelling, Thrudheim, and Thrudvang, strength home and strong field. The giant Rugnir is called Thief of Thrud, in allusion to some unrecorded abduction of her. Thor's sons are Magni, his mother Jarnsaxa, and Modi, who survived the doom of the gods and inherit his hammer. They are personifications of his might, Magni, and wrath, Modi. When Magni was 3 days old, he lifted the giant Rungnir's foot off Thor, a feat which none of the Aesir could do. Thor's brother is Meili, of whom nothing is known. His servants are Thjalfi and Roskva, children of a husbandman, according to a story presently to be told. His relationship to Jord is seen in the epithet given to him, Bur Jarthar, son of earth, in Lokasenna and Thrymskvida. Thor's names and epithets throw light on his character and functions. He is Thrudvaldr Goda, the strong one of the gods, Veor Midgards, warder of earth. Vinner Verlidha, the friend of man. Vingnir, the hurler. Vingthor, Thor the hurler. Lorithi, the noisy one. Orm's Ain Bunny, serpent's destroyer. Thor's Radbunny, giant killer. These show him as a champion of the gods, the thunder god, the destroyer of obnoxious powers and beings, the helper of men. Though in origin a thunder god, he has other aspects, mostly of a beneficent kind, as summed up in Adam of Bremer's account, cited above. As thunder god, his functions show that the thunderstorm was regarded in a beneficent aspect as furthering fertility. Sacrifices were made and prayers offered to Thor by the Swedes and Norsemen in times of famine and sickness, as Adam of Bremen and a passage in the Eirik saga show. Thorkel prayed to Thor, the red-bearded god, for food, and he sent a whale to the shore. Thor helped to make the ground arable, and protected men against rocks and cliffs. To seafarers he was helpful, giving them favorable winds. The Norman Vikings offered him human victims before setting sail, and animal and food offerings were made to him by voyages to Iceland. Helgi and Finn asked him where he should land in Iceland, and he was advised to go to Eyjafjord. Helgi was a Christian, but was still so inclined to the old faith that he sought Thor's help in all seafaring and difficult journeys. Krauko Reidar and his party sailed to Iceland, and he made vows to Thor in order that he should point out a site for his possession. Though the land to which he was directed belonged to another, Krauko maintained that Thor had sent him to it and intended him to settle there. Settlers in Iceland dedicated their land to Thor and called it by his name. Hence the great number of place names which bear witness to the cult of Thor. Several accounts in the saga show how prominent this cult was in the lives of the Norse settlers in Iceland. Rolf, who was called Thorolf, had been guardian of Thor's temple on the island of Most near the Norwegian coast. He was called a great friend of Thor's, and, when he quarrelled with King Harald, he made a great sacrifice and inquired of his beloved friend Thor whether he should make peace with the king or leave Norway. The answer was that he should go to Iceland. He now took the temple to pieces and removed the timbers and earth from the spot where Thor's image had rested. On drawing near Iceland, he threw overboard the pillars carved with Thor's image, believing that by them he would be guided to a landing place. They drifted ashore at a place afterwards called Thorness, and there Thorolf landed and built a temple. Other examples of this use of pillars are given in the Landnamabok, as well as of taking down a temple before migrating. The Kjalnesinga saga tells of a great sacrificer called Thorgrim, grandson of Ingolf, the first settler in Iceland. He had a large temple to which all his men had to pay toll. He held Thor in highest honor, and in the temple his image was in the center, with those of other deities on either hand. The dedication of sons to the service of Thor is also spoken of in the sagas. Thorolf, himself dedicated to Thor, gave his son Stein to the god as Thorstein. His son in turn, Grim called Thorgrim, was also dedicated to Thor in order that he should be a temple priest. The naming of lands or places or persons after Thor is prominent in stories of the settlement of Iceland. Thor's power over the winds and storms is also seen in the fact that he caused shipwreck to those who forsook their allegiance to him by turning to Christianity. In the Njals saga, Thangbrand, a Christian, was asked by Steinvora, mother of Ref the Skald, if he had heard that Thor challenged Christ to single combat, and that he dared not accept the challenge. He replied that he had heard that Thor was but dust and ashes, if God had not willed that he should live. Then she asked him if he knew how he had been shipwrecked, and told him that Thor had done this. Little good was Christ when Thor shattered ships to pieces. A storm roused by Thor dashed the bark to splinters small. An Icelander named Thorgisil became a Christian, and in dreams was threatened by Thor if he did not return to his allegiance. The ship on which he was sailing encountered a great storm caused by Thor. The god asked him in one dream to pay him what he had vowed to him. On awaking, he recalled that this was a calf which was now an old ox. He threw it overboard, as this was the reason that Thor was haunting the ship. Thor's aid was also sought in war. Styrbjorn prayed to him for victory over King Eirik, who prayed to Odin, and because he was mightier than Thor, Eirik was victorious. At banquets, a cup of wine, consecrated by the sign of Thor's hammer, was drunk to him. At a certain banquet, Earl Sigurd signed the first cup to Odin. King Hakon, a Christian, took it and signed it with the cross, whereupon Sigurd said that he was signing it to Thor with the hammer sign. Before discussing Thor's possessions, a passage from Snorri's Edda describing him may be quoted. He is strongest of gods and men. His realm is in Thrudvang. His hall is Bilskirnir, and in it are 540 rooms. That is the greatest house known to men. Here Snorri quotes a verse of Grimnismal, in which Odin describes his son's hall and says that it is the greatest of all houses, that is, greater even than his own Valhall. The stanza is an interpolation, but it may be a reminiscence of Thor's supreme place among the gods, and it is significant also that, in describing the various seats of the gods, Odin begins not with his own, but with Thor's. Snorri then speaks of Thor's chariots and goats, and his 3 precious possessions, hammer, girdle, and iron gloves. Thor has 2 he-goats called Tangjost, or Tooth Gnasher, and Tangrisnir, or Tooth Gritter, and a chariot in which he drives, drawn by them. Hence he is called Oku Thor, or Wagon Thor. Snorri also quotes the poet Cormac, who said, "In his wagon Thor sitteth." The wagon is the car of Hrungnir's slayer, on which runes were bidden to be written by Mimir. In thunderstorms, a god or supernatural being is often supposed to be on a journey through the sky, and this was true of Thor. A thunderclap was radar thruma, the rumbling noise of chariot wheels. In Sweden, the people said during thunder, Godgubben aker, Goffar aker, the good old fellow, or the gaffer drives. In Gothland, thunder is Thors akan, or Thor's driving, and in Schleswig-Holstein, the noise of thunder is attributed to the rumbling of a wagon through the air, that is, Thor's wagon. Hence his name Okuthor, or such epithets as Valdi Kjola, ruler of the wagon, Reidartur, god of the wagon, Vagnaver, wagon man. From the goats which drew the wagon, Thor was called Hafradrotin, the lord of the goats. One of the myths of Thor told by Snorri begins, Okuthor drove out with his he-goats and his chariot. And, in the Haustlong of Theodulf of Wynn, we see the goats driving the god in his wagon to fight with giants. Hail beats down, earth is rent, rocks shake, crags are shivered, the sky burns, as he rolls along, the description of a thunderstorm. Thrumskvita describes how the mountains were rent and earth burned with fire, as the goats drove Thor's wagon to Jotunheim. Besides going in his wagon, Thor is depicted walking, while the other gods ride. Thus he walks to the daily thing, or perhaps to the final catastrophe, wading through many rivers according to an obscure passage in Grimnismal. The hammer Mjolnir, which is known to the frost giants and hill giants when it is raised aloft, and little wonder, for it has smashed many a skull of their fathers or kinsfolk. This mighty or murder-greedy hammer was made by the dwarf Sindri, and was deemed by the gods to be best of all precious works. It could be wielded by Thor only when he wore his iron gloves. However hard he smote, it would not fail him. If he threw it, it would never miss, nor fly so far as not to return to his hands. If he desired, it could become so small that he could keep it under his shirt. The only flaw in it was the shortness of its haft. With his hammer, Thor slew monsters and giants, and forced Loki to keep silence by threatening him with it. Thunder and lightning sometimes preceded its stroke. Hence it is most easily explained as the thunderbolt, which, in German superstition, was an essential part of the lightning flash, and believed to be a black wedge which buried itself in the earth, but at each succeeding thunderstorm rose towards the surface, which it reached in 7 years. Does this belief correspond to the statement that Thor's hammer returned to his hand after being thrown? The superstition is echoed in Thrumskvita, in which the giant Thrum steals the hammer and buries it 8 miles deep in the earth. In many regions, flint weapons found in the earth are believed to be thunderbolts, and the myth of Thor's hammer is doubtless connected with this belief. They are generally used as amulets or for magical purposes. The hammer was a sacred symbol, and the sign of the hammer was used in consecrations and blessings. This custom is reflected in certain passages of the Eddas. The giant Thrym, believing the disguised Thor to be Freya, the bride demanded by him, said, "Bring now the hammer to bless the bride. Lay Mjolnir in the maiden's bosom, that our bond may be consecrated in Vor's name." Thor himself hallowed the hides and bones of his dead goats with his hammer, so that they lived again. With it he also hallowed Baldur's pyre. The sign of the hammer, as in Christian circles the sign of the cross, was made over cups of liquor, especially in sacrifices. As a divine symbol, the hammer was used for many purposes. Sickness was healed by it, demons kept at a distance, marriages consecrated. According to Norse custom, when a newly born child had been accepted by its father and so permitted to live, it was washed and signed with Thor's hammer, that is, a symbol of that mythic weapon, and thus received into the family. The hammer carved in a tombstone showed that the dead man was dedicated to Thor. Small hammers were used as amulets, and specimens of these have been found in Denmark and Sweden. Thor's hammers were used by the island men in their ancient faith, according to Saxo, who calls them Maleos Jovialis. The men of old thought that thunder was caused by such hammers, and they apparently used them in thunderstorms. In circa 1123 AD, Magnus Nicolason, the Dane, spoiled Thor's temple in Sweden of these tokens of the gods, and the Swedes considered him guilty of sacrilege. All this points to the connection of Thor's hammer both with the mythic powers attributed to weapons and with the superstitious use of stone weapons regarded as supernatural. Thor's hammer became the possession of Magni and Modi, his sons, in the renewed world. When Thor clasps his girdle around him, his divine strength is increased by half. In his iron gloves, his third precious possession, there is also much virtue. Thor is red-bearded, though whether this redness alludes to the fiery appearance of lightning, as Grimm supposed, is doubtful. He shakes his beard when roused. When he speaks into it, everyone quails. His anger is described by his bristling hair and tossing beard, or he lets his brows sink down below his eyes, so that whoso looks at him must fall down before his glance alone. Flame flashes from his eyes. When Thor met King Olaf at a time when Christianity was encroaching on his cult, he blew hard into his beard and raised his beard's voice, with the result that a storm arose. He is seen travelling on foot like a peasant, carrying a basket on his back, an appropriate appearance for a god of the peasants and the folk. He visits a peasant's house for a night's lodging, and from such a house he took his servants Thjalfi and Roskva. Thjalfi, the swift runner, is so swift that only Hugi or Thought can beat him. Hence he may be a personification of lightning. Peasant-like, too, is Thor in his wordy flighting with Odin in Harbardsljóð. At the doom of the gods, Thor fights with the Midgard serpent, which he slays, but falls dead through its venom. Thor is often described as journeying to the east to fight giants or trolls. The Eddas contain several myths of these expeditions and combats. Indeed, no other Eddic god has so many myths told of him as Thor. Several of his titles refer to his power over giants and monsters: adversary and slayer of giants and troll women, smiter of Hrungnir, of Geirrod, of Thrivaldi, foe of the Midgard serpent, hewer in sunder of the 9 heads of Thrivaldi, merciless destroyer of giantesses. Hence also he is the defender of Asgard and of Midgard. In his aspect as queller of giants, Thor, the thunder god, represents the folk belief that thunder is obnoxious to giants, trolls, and other demoniac beings. The myths in which Thor plays a part will now be given, beginning with that of the giant Hrungnir. After Odin's visit to Hrungnir, the giant pursued him into Asgard. The Aesir gave Hrungnir drink out of Thor's flagons, and when drunk, the giant boasted that he would carry Valhall into Jotunheim and kill all the deities, save Sif and Freya. Freya alone dared pour ale for him, and now, as his insolence increased, the gods called for Thor. Thor, swinging his hammer, asked why Hrungnir was drinking here, and who had given him safe conduct, and, hearing from him that it was Odin, Thor said that he would repent of his presence there. Hrungnir protested that Thor would have no fame for killing a defenseless giant, and offered to fight him on the borders of Grjotungard. He then rode back to Jotunheim, and news of the duel was spread among the giants, who feared for themselves lest Thor should win. They made a giant of clay, 9 miles high and 3 broad, and gave him a mare's heart. Hrungnir had a stone heart with 3 corners. Of stone also were his head and shield. His weapon was a whetstone. Beside him stood the clay giant, Mokkurkalfi, in great terror. Thor and Thjalfi went to the meeting, and Thjalfi ran forward and advised the giant to stand on his shield, for Thor would come up through the earth to him. This he did. Now arose thunder and lightnings, and Thor in divine fury, Asmodi, swung his hammer and cast it at Hrungnir, who meanwhile threw his whetstone. The weapons crashed together, and part of the whetstone fell to earth, forming all the whinstone rocks. Part of it burst on Thor's head, so that he fell forward. The hammer, however, broke Hrungnir's head in pieces, and he fell with his foot on Thor's neck. Thjalfi struck the clay giant down. He tried to raise Hrungnir's foot from Thor's neck, but could not. Neither could any of the Aesir when they arrived. None could succeed but Magni, Thor's 3 days old son by the giantess Jarthnaxa. "Sad it is," he said, "Father, that I came so late, for I would have slain this giant with my fist had I come sooner." Thor praised him and gave him Hrungnir's horse, which Odin said should have been given to him. The whetstone fragment remained in Thor's head. The wise woman Groa, wife of Aurvandil the Valiant, sang spells over Thor until the stone was loosened. Thor told her how he had waded from the north over Elivagar, icy stream, bearing Aurvandil in a basket on his back from Jotunheim. As one of his toes stuck out of the basket, he broke it off and cast it up to the sky, where it is now the star called Aurvandil's toe. He also said that soon Aurvandil would be home, and in her joy Groa forgot her incantations, and the stone remained in Thor's head. Hence, a stone should not be cast across the floor, for the stone is then stirred in his head. A poem by Theodulf of Wynn, 10th century, deals with this myth as depicted on a shield, and gives a vivid description of the rending of earth, the beating down of hail, and the shaking of the rocks, as Thor drives forth in his wagon to the fight. There are occasional references to the myth in the Eddic and other poems. Thor calls Mjolnir Hrungnir's slayer, and he himself is Hrungnir's killer, smiter of Hrungnir, skull splitter of Hrungnir. The stone shield is blade of Hrungnir's foot soles, according to a kenning, because the giant stood on it. The fullest reference is in Harbard's Ljod. Harbard said to Thor that he would awake his attack, and that since Hrungnir died, no stouter opponent has faced him. Thor replied, "Thou now remindest me how I with Hrungnir fought, the insolent Jotun, whose head was all of stone. Yet I made him fall and sink before me." While the foundation of this myth may be the effect of a thunderstorm in the mountains, the further modern interpretations of details in it can only be regarded as highly problematical. The story of the part of the whetstone which stuck in Thor's head is possibly an aetiological myth originating as an explanation of images of the god Thor, which, as among the Lapps, had an iron nail with a piece of flint stuck in the head, as if Thor should strike out fire. The purpose of this iron and flint was probably to produce the sacrificial fire. On the high seat pillars of the Norsemen, the image of Thor was carved, and in the head was set the Reginagli. In earlier times, flint may have been used instead of iron in these images. Aurvandil, the sea wanderer, is the hero Orendil, still sung in an epic of the 12th century, and possibly the Horvendilas of Saxo, father of Amleth, or Hamlet. The constellation Earendel was also known to the Anglo-Saxons. This constellation is thought to be Orion. Another giant adventure of Thor's is that in Geirrod's land, related by Snorri. Loki, flying in Frigg's hawk plumage, went to Geirrod's court, where he was shut up in a chest for 3 months. In order to get free, he told Geirrod that he would induce Thor to come there without his hammer or girdle. Thor, having been persuaded, went off with Loki and spent the night with the giantess Grid, mother of Vidar, who told him of Geirrod's craft and lent him a pair of iron gloves, a girdle of might, and a staff called Grid's staff, Gridar Volur. By aid of the staff, Thor crossed Vimur, greatest of rivers, Loki holding on to the girdle of might. When they were in midstream, Gjalp, daughter of Geirrod, caused the waters to increase. Thor sang, "Swell not, O Vimur, I must wade through thee to the giant's garth. If thou swellest, so will swell my divine strength in me up to heaven." Going forward, he saw how Gjalp caused the swelling of the stream, and caused her to retire by throwing a stone at her. Then taking hold of a rowan tree on the bank, he pulled himself out. Hence the rowan is called Thor's deliverance. Reaching Geirrod's court, Thor was given a seat which moved under him to the roof. Thrusting his staff against the rafters, he pushed back the chair, which now crashed on Gjalp and his sister Grape, breaking their backs. Geirrod called him to play games in a hall where great fires burned, and taking with the tongs a white-hot iron bar from the fire, he threw it at Thor, who caught it with his iron gloves. Seeing him about to throw it at him, Geirrod leaped behind an iron pillar, through which the bar passed, as well as through Geirrod and the wall into the earth. This myth is the subject of a poem by Eilif Gudrunarsson, circa 976 AD, in which not Loki but Thjalfi accompanies Thor. Saxo Grammaticus, in his account of King Gorm's visit to the land of Geruthus, or Geirrod, refers to the hurt done by Thor to him and his daughters, here 3 in number. Geirrod's land is full of treasure. The way to it across the ocean is beset with peril. Sun and stars are left behind, and the journey is taken down to chaos, to a land of darkness and horror, and here the story is probably colored by visions of hell. Long ago, the god Thor had been provoked by the insolence of the giants to drive red-hot irons through the vitals of Geirrod, who strove with him. The iron slid further, tore up the mountain, and battered through its side. The women were stricken by the might of his thunderbolts, and were punished for their attempt on Thor by having their backs broken. The myth of Humir is told by Snorri and also in the Eddic poem Humskvita. Snorri says that Thor went from Midgard on foot and in haste disguised as a youth, and arrived at the giant Hymir's abode. Next morning he wished to aid Hymir in fishing, but Hymir said he was so small that he would freeze. Thor's anger was great, but he restrained himself from attacking Hymir, as he had another purpose to fulfill. To obtain bait, he struck off the head of Hymir's largest ox, Himinbrjot. He aided Hymir in rowing to the usual fishing banks, and beyond them, in spite of the giant's fear of the Midgard serpent. Thor prepared a strong line with a large hook, on which he fixed the ox's head. Then he cast it overboard, intending to beguile the Midgard serpent. The monster snapped at the bait and was caught by the hook, dashing off so quickly that Thor's fists crashed against the gunwale. Thor's divine anger came upon him. He braced his feet so firmly that they dashed through the planking and struck the bottom of the ship. Then he drew the serpent up, flashing fiery glances at it, while it glared at him and blew venom. The giant was in terror, and, while Thor clutched his hammer, he fumbled for his knife and hacked the line, so that the serpent fell back into the sea. Thor hurled his hammer after it, and men say that he struck off its head, but I think it were true to tell thee that the serpent still lives and lies in the encompassing sea. Then Thor struck Hymir with his fist and sent him overboard, and he himself waded ashore. Snorri makes this adventure one taken in revenge for Thor's outwitting by Utgard Loki, of which we shall hear presently. The Humskvita gives a somewhat different version of the myth, showing that Snorri must have used other sources, and it is the subject of several poems, verses of which are quoted by him in Skaldskaparmal. The Humskveta, which is based on earlier lays, consists of 3 incidents: the obtaining of a kettle for the god's banquet, the Humir story, and the tale of Thor's goats. The third has no real connection with the rest of the poem, the 2 incidents of which are much more welded together. The gods were feasting and not satisfied, so they used divining twigs to discover where more drink could be obtained. They learned that there was plenty in the hall of the giant or sea god Aegir, and to him they went, bidding him prepare a feast for them. The giant sought revenge and bade Thor bring a kettle in which to brew ale. The gods did not know where to seek it, until Tyr, who here calls Humir his father, said that Humir had a mighty kettle, a mile deep. Thor and Tyr set out to the east of Elivagar at the end of heaven, where Humir dwelt, first going to Egil's house, where Thor left his goats. At Humir's abode, Tyr found his grandmother, who had 900 heads, and his bright-browed mother, who brought them ale. She hid them beneath the kettle, for Humir was often hostile to guests. Late returned the giant from hunting, icicles threatening on his bed. His wife told him that Thor and their son Tyr, long waited for, had come, and was sitting under the gable, behind the beam. The giant looked at the gable. It gave way, and 8 kettles fell, of which all but one, that under which the gods were hiding, broke. The giant saw them, and, though enraged, could not forget the duty of hospitality. 3 oxen were slaughtered, and their flesh boiled. Of these, Thor ate 2, to Hymir's amazement. The poem now passes suddenly to the fishing incident. Hymir bids Thor go and get bait from the oxen. On this expedition, Hymir caught 2 whales, while Thor was still preparing his hook with great cunning. Having cast it, he drew up the serpent, and struck at it hill of hair, or head, with his hammer, and it sank into the sea. Thor and Hymir returned to the giant's house. Hymir would reckon no one strong who could not break his glass cup. Thor struck the stone pillars with it. They broke, but not the cup. Now Hymir's wife told Thor to strike the giant's head with the cup, for that was harder than the glass. Hymir bewailed his treasure, and said that now they might take the kettle if they could move it. Tyr tried in vain. Thor raised it to his head and set off. The giant with other many-headed ones out of caves pursued. Thor put down the kettle, swung his hammer and slew the giants. Thus the kettle was brought to the gods. After the killing of the giants, one of Thor's goats was found with its leg hurt. This evil Loki had done. Nothing further is said of this in the poem, and the goat incident is told by Snorri in another connection. This lay consists mainly of a widespread folk tale, to which the episode of the Midgard serpent has been attached, unlike the prose account. Heroes come to a giant's abode to seek some coveted possession. In the adventure, they are aided by the giant's wife or daughter, and so overcome him and obtain the desired object. Thor and Tyr are here made the heroes of the tale. The cup is suggestive of the giant's life token, containing his soul, but contrary to usual custom, though it is broken, the giant does not immediately die. Such folk tales usually tell how the pursuers are stopped by transformed objects thrown down by the pursued. This is lacking in the lay. That the kettle signifies the sea, frozen in winter, that is, in the power of the frost giant, and freed by the first thunderstorm in spring, seems a forced and unnatural explanation of the tale. a gigantic vessel would rather be the rock basin or shores containing the sea, not the sea itself. The adventure with the Midgard serpent prefigures the coming time when, at the doom of the gods, Thor will have to engage with it. But this adventure may have given rise to the conception of that final combat with the monster. The suggestion of both prose and poetic narrative is that the serpent is slain or receives a severe wound. The poem called Bragi's Shield Lay and the Husdrapa both describe the adventure, and in the latter, Thor struck the serpent a deadly blow and smote off its head as it rose from the sea. One of the finest Eddic poems, Thrumskvita, or Lay of Thrym, composed about 900 AD, has, as its subject, the recovery of Thor's hammer from the giant Thrym, who had stolen it. Ving Thor awoke to find his hammer missing. Great was his rage, hair bristling, beard shaking, as he sought it. Loki was told of his loss, and together they sought Freya and borrowed her feather dress. In this, Loki flew to Jotunheim, as he had flown to Geirrod's realm, where Thrym, lord of the giants, sat on a mound, making golden leashes for his dogs and stroking the manes of his steeds. "How fares it with gods and elves? Why comest thou alone to Jotunheim?" he cried to Loki. "Ill fares it with gods and elves," replied Loki. "Hast thou hidden Jolrith's hammer?" Thrym said it was hidden 8 miles deep. None would win it back, unless Freya was given him as a bride. Back flew Loki to Thor with the tidings, and again they sought Freya, Loki bidding her blind on the bridal veil and haste to Jotunheim with him. So great was Freya's anger that the god's dwelling was shaken and her necklace, Brisingamen, broke. The gods met in council. How was the hammer to be recovered? Heimdall advised that Thor, disguised as Freya, should go to Thrym. Thor refused such unmanly conduct, but Loki bade him be silent, for if the advice were not followed, and he did not recover his hammer, the giants would soon dwell in Asgard, a significant statement. So the bridal veil was put on Thor, with a woman's dress, keys at her girdle, a woman's headgear, and the necklace and other gems. Loki attended him as a maidservant, and in the goat's chariot they sped to Jotunheim, while the mountains burst and blazed with fire. Thrym bade a great feast to be prepared. To his amazement, Thor ate an ox, ate salmon, and all the dainties provided for the women, and drank 3 huge vessels of mead. Loki said that the bride had been fasting for 8 nights, in her longing for Jotunheim. Thrym, eager to kiss the bride, lifted her veil, but at the sight of the fiery eyes, leaped back the length of the hall. Loki explained that for 8 nights the bride had not slept, in her longing for Jotunheim. Now came the giant sister, asking the bridal fee, rings of gold from the bride's hand, if she would gain her love and favour. Then Thrym commanded that the hammer be brought to hallow the bride, and placed on her knees, that the hand of Vor, goddess of vows, might bless them both. Thor laughed inwardly, and, seizing the hammer, slew Thrym and all the giants and his sister. Some dualistic conceptions may lie behind this myth. The giant wishes to gain the power of the gods, and steals its symbol and medium, the hammer Mjolnir. But what precisely the giant represents, whether a primitive thunder deity, or demon, or the force of winter, is problematical. Thor, whose strength is quiescent apart from his hammer, may represent here a nature god whose power wanes in winter, but waxes in spring. If this is the mythic foundation, the story is built upon it without itself having any significance in nature phenomena. It is well told, with much humour, and Thor excellently sustains the part of the bride. The story is remembered in Norse folk tales. Here, there is a quest by Thor for his own property, as in Humskvita for that of another, in Jotunheim. In both tales he eats in a gluttonish manner, and in both he ends by slaying the giants. Still another exploit of Thor's against a giant is found in the tale of the building of a citadel for the gods, which would be proof against the hill giants and frost giants. This was done by a giant craftsman, Smither, on condition that he should have Freya and the sun and moon. The occasion of the building was after the attack on Asgard by the Vanir. The god said that the giant must complete it in one season, and that he would lose his reward if it were not done by the first day of summer. The bargain was sealed with many oaths, since it was unsafe for the giant to be in Asgard without truce, should Thor, who was in the east fighting trolls, return. The giant asked permission for the help of his stallion, Swadilfari. He began on the first day of winter, and the gods were amazed to see the horse drawing such huge stones. Within 3 days of summer, the work was nearly done. The gods were inclined to evade their promise, asking who had advised handing over Freya, or so destroying air and sky as to propose taking sun and moon from them. All agreed that Loki must have advised this. He deserved death if he could not devise means of outwitting the giant. Accordingly, in the form of a mare he met Swadilfari, who snapped his traces and rushed after the mare. The giant fell into frenzy, knowing that the work would not now be finished. The god sent for Thor, who came and struck the giant into fragments with his hammer. Loki gave birth to a foal with 8 feet, Odin's horse Sleipnir. This bargain and Thor's deliverance of the gods are referred to in Voluspa, quoted also by Snorri. Then went the powers to their judgment seats, the all-holy gods, and thereon held council, who had all the air with venom mingled, or given odds made to the giant race. Then alone was Thor with anger swollen, he seldom sits when the like he hears. Oaths were broken, words and pledges, the mighty bonds between them made. Behind this myth, as applied to the gods and their citadel, is the traditional belief that large buildings of unknown origin must have been the work of giants. Some German and Scandinavian folk tales closely resemble the story, though the method of outwitting giant, troll, or devil is different. Thor here appears as guardian and helper of the gods, as in the Hrungnir myth. So, Lokasenna shows him coming into the banquet hall, where Loki has been slandering the deities, and bidding him be silent, or he will close his mouth. So the skald Thorborn sang. Bravely fought Thor for Asgard, and the followers of Odin. Other adventures of Thor with giants are mentioned in the Eddas. Harbardsljóð and the skald Bragi attribute to him the destruction of Thjazi, the thick, and the casting of his eyes to heaven. The former deed, however, is ascribed to the gods generally by Snorri and in Lokasenna, the latter to Odin by Snorri. Thor slew the 9-headed Thrivaldi, broke the leg of Laken, and slew giantesses. Eastward I fared and felled the giants' ill-working women, says Thor in Harbardsljóð. And again, when I was in the east, guarding the river, the sons of Svarang sought me and assailed me with stones. But little joy was theirs. They were first to sue for peace. He also slew the brides of the berserkers in Lesey, who were like she-wolves rather than women. They crushed his ship and threatened him with iron clubs, and drove off Thjalfi. In Hjunloljóð, Thor is said by Freya to love little the brides of the giants. Of the tales here referred to, or in the epithet Slayer of Rod, nothing is known. In these myths, Thor is a boisterous, undaunted being, opponent of the forces which are inimical to the rule of the gods and, therefore, presumably, to the welfare of men. These forces, personified as giants, are the wild, harsh, sinister aspects of nature, all in nature that is opposed to the kindly forces of growth and fertility. Another long story, related by Snorri, may have less mythical significance than some are disposed to discover in it. It rather suggests the inventive imagination of one well-versed in folk tale formulae than a myth proper, though the first incident belongs to Thor mythology. Thor and Loki stayed for the night at a peasant's house, where the god slew his goats as a meal for his host and his family and guests. He bade them lay the bones on the hides, but Thjalfi, the peasant's son, split a thigh bone to extract the marrow. Next morning, Thor resuscitated the goats by swinging his hammer, and, discovering that one was lame, was angry and so terrified the peasant that he and his family offered all they had as a recompense. Thor therefore took his son Thjalfi and his daughter Roskva as his servants. All four journeyed towards Jotunheim, and at night reached a great forest, where they found a huge hole in which they lay for the night. At midnight, an earthquake caused them to seek shelter in a side chamber. Thor kept watch with his hammer at its entrance. In the morning he went out and found a huge man sleeping and snoring. He would have struck him with his hammer, but for the first time his heart failed him. The giant recognized him as Asa Thor, and, telling him that his name was Skrymir, asked why he had dragged away his glove. Then Thor saw that the hole with the inner chamber where they had slept was Skrymir's glove with his thumb. All now joined forces and shared their food, but next night Thor was unable to open the provision bag, try as he might. Skrymir was asleep. Seizing his hammer, he dealt him 3 successive blows on the head. After each blow, Skrymir said that a leaf had fallen on him, then an acorn, then some bird droppings. Next morning he left the others after directing them to Utgard, and bidding them not boast before its lord, Utgard Loki. Arrived at the castle of Utgard, its lord spoke of Thor as a toddler, and asked what accomplishments he and the others could show. Loki said that no one could eat food more rapidly than he. A trough of food was set out, and 1 logi of fire was set to eat against him, and ate meat, bones, and trough also. The swift Thjalfi was beaten in a race by the lad Hugi. Thor boasted of his drinking feats, but could not do more in 3 prodigious draughts than take a little from a horn which was given him. Then he attempted to lift Utgard Loki's cat, but could do no more than raise one of its feet from the ground. Lastly, he attempted to wrestle and throw Utgard Loki's nurse Elli, but was himself brought to one knee. Now Utgard Loki bade them spend the night in feasting. Next morning Thor admitted that he must be called a man of little might, but Utgard Loki said that he would never have received him, had he known he was so strong. He himself was Skyrmir, and had prepared eye illusions to outwit him. The provision bag was bound with iron, hence Thor could not undo its apparent knots. He had struck 3 terrific blows, which would have been fatal had not Skyrmir placed a hill between himself and them, and the hill was now deeply indented. Logi was fire, and thus could consume meat, bones, and trough so quickly. Hugi was thought, and Thjalfi could not outrun him. The end of the horn was in the sea, so Thor could not empty it, yet he had diminished the sea, and this is the cause of ebb tides. The cat was the Midgard serpent, and Thor had raised it nearly to heaven. Elli was old age, and it was a marvel that Thor had withstood her so long. Hearing all this, Thor clutched his hammer and was about to strike when he found that Utgard Loki had vanished, and where the castle stood was a wide plain. Hence Thor resolved to encounter the Midgard serpent again, if he could. The goat episode is referred to in Humskvita, as has been seen. In Harbard's Ljóð, Harbard taunts Thor with cowardice in creeping into the glove of Skirmir, here called Fjalar. And in Lokasenna, Loki sneers at him for the same act and for believing that he was no longer Thor, and for failing to open Skirmir's provision bag. How far the episodes of this story are to be interpreted in terms of natural phenomena, or what these may be, is difficult to say, in spite of many attempts in this direction. Some of the mythical conceptions of the North are here. Thor in his contest with giant or unearthly powers, the region of these powers, Utgard, outside land, the power of Thor's hammer penetrating a hill, the might of fire, the Midgard serpent, the idea that a god is superior to old age, yet not immortal, the mythic explanation of the origin of ebb tide. But, on the whole, the story, the longest in Snorri, is perhaps no more than a skillful weaving of episodes and ideas into one tale, utilizing Martian formulae, deception and glamour, by which even gods are deceived, and the futility of a race with thought or of defeating old age. The episode of the restoration of Thor's goats to life has many folktale parallels, in which dead or dismembered persons or animals are restored. A near parallel is found in Celtic mythology. One of the swine of the god Mannanan is slain and cooked, and afterwards restored to life, in a story where the god and his wife are hosts to the adventurer Cormac. Mannanan's swine were immortal, and myth said of them that killed one day they came alive next day, and with their flesh the gods were made immortal. By some, Utgard Loki is regarded as a form of Loki himself, partly because the Midgard serpent, his offspring, appears in the story. But as Loki himself shares in the adventure, this is unlikely, and he may be regarded as an abstraction of giant power, against which, for once, Thor sets himself in vain. A distorted form of Utgard Loki, with traits of the medieval devil, appears in Ugarthilokus, whom Saxo describes as a being or deity to whom sacrifices are paid. King Gorm was perplexed about immortality. Some of his courtiers told him that the gods should be consulted and suggested that Thorkil should be sent on this mission. Thorkil sailed to a sunless region and reached a place where he entered a foul cavern, at the entrance to which were two huge men, swart, with beaked noses. One of them told Thorkil that he had a dangerous journey before him in his desire to visit a strange god. After 4 days roving in darkness, he would reach a dark land and discover Ugarthilokus in his grisly caves. When Thorkil and his party reached these caves, they saw seats covered with serpents, and beyond this another cave with a foul room where Ugarthilokus was bound with chains. Each of his hairs was as large as a spear of cornel. Thorkil plucked one from his beard as a token, and straightway a foul stench nearly choked the visitors. Only 5 escaped with Thorkil, pursued by demons. Eventually he reached Germany and became a Christian. King Gorm was so affected by his description of Ugarthilokus that he died. Many of the bystanders perished of the smell from the hair when he produced it. Gorm himself, after visiting Geirrod's realm, on the return journey had obtained fair weather by vows and peace offerings to Ugarthilochus. In this narrative, Ugarthilochus is rather a blending of Loki chained by the gods and the medieval Satan bound in hell than the Utgard Loki of Snorri's story. Another story, the subject of Alvismal, shows how Thor tricked a dwarf and caused his destruction. The narrative part of this Eddic poem is slight. Most of it consists of questions put by Thor to the dwarf Alvis about the different names, mainly fanciful, given to earth, heaven, moon, sun, clouds, wind, calm, sea, etc., by men, gods, Vanir, giants, dwarves, and elves. These different synonyms resemble the artificial kennings of the skalds, but more recent investigation shows that some, at least, are circumlocutions used, example, at sea, to avoid the real names, which were dangerous and taboo. Alvis has come by night to claim Thor's daughter Thrud, who had been promised him by the gods in Thor's absence. Thor confronts Alvis and asks who he is and why he is so pale of face, as if he had been lying with the dead. Alvis says that his home is under the earth, beneath the rocks. He has come to speak with the wagon man, Vagnaver, and trusts that the gods will keep their word. Thor says that he will break it, for, as father, he has foremost right over the bride, nor was he present when the promise was made. Alvis pretends to take Thor for a wandering man. Such is his appearance. I am Vingthor, the wide wanderer, long beards, Sigdranis, or Odin's son, and against my will shalt thou take the maid, cries Thor. Alvis says he would fain gain her through goodwill, and Thor says that he will not keep her from a guest so wise, if only he will tell about every world of which he asks him. Then follow the questions and answers. At the end of them, Thor says he has never known such wealth of knowledge in a single breast, but he has detained Alvis by craft and betrayed him. The day has caught thee, O dwarf. The sun, deceiver of Dwalin, shines in the hole. The dwarf is destroyed by daylight, fatal to under-earth beings, and Thor thus overcomes him by craft, as he overcomes giants by strength. Thor's role of seeker after wisdom is unusual, and rather suggests that of Odin in Voluspa, Vafthrudnismal, etc. If Miss Philpotts is right in her theory that many of the Eddic poems are folk dramas, there is a distinct group in which, as she points out, a god causes the death of his opponent. Odin slays Vafthrudnir. Freya destroys the giantess Hyndla by fire. But the role of destroyer is mainly Thor's, the great champion of gods and men against all dangerous forces, and especially the frost giants. The power of frost was feared by the northern people, and a mighty winter was expected to destroy all life in the future, as will be seen later. Such folk dramas were not performed merely with a view to entertainment. Hence, when Thor was represented destroying giants, the purpose was to secure his victory in actual fights against these forces. The dramas were in fact a kind of mimetic magic, intended to bring about the result which was enacted. The time of the action drama may have been the winter festival of Yule, when evil powers were in the ascendant. Then it was necessary to strengthen the hands of the guardian of Midgard, the champion of gods and men. Miss Philpotts also makes the interesting suggestion that if the lost poem on which Snorri founded his story of Thor and Hrungnir was a folk drama, then an effigy probably represented Hrungnir. This effigy, after the dramatic tradition was lost, was regarded as an accessory to Hrungnir and called Mokkur Kalfi. Chapter 6. The Greater Gods, Tyr. The Eddic god Tyr was known to other Teutonic tribes as Zio or Zu, Tu or Tu. These names are deduced from the Teutonic names of the third day of the week: Ziastag, Tuesdag, Tursdager, and Tusdager. The prevalence of these names in the Rhine region, Upper Germany, North Germany, Saxony, and Scandinavia shows that this god was widely known. The primitive form of the name was Tiwaz, which has been regarded as the equivalent of the Vedic Diaos, Greek Zeus, Latin Dies Piter, or Jupiter. Others connect Tiwaz rather with the primitive Devios, or Deus, Sanskrit Devas, Latin Divas, Norse Divar, gods, probably a plural of Tyr, god. This would agree with the Norse use of Tyr in the general sense of god, as in Sigtyr, Veratyr, Hangatyr, etc. The former derivation would point to Tiwaz as an early Teutonic sky god, but the occurrence of the various forms of the name in the titles of the third day of the week as equivalents of Dies Martis suggests that the sky god had become a god of war, or that greater emphasis had been laid on some of his functions, the result of the growing place of war as a business of life among the Teutons. Tacitus says that Mars had a high place with certain tribes or groups of tribes. The Tencteri on the east side of the Rhine regarded Mars as chief of the gods. The god who had a highly sacred grove among the Semnons, a branch of the Suevi, and to whom human sacrifices were offered, is supposed to have been Zio. He is not named, but he is called Regnator Omnium. In the 6th century, Jordanes says of the gods that they sacrificed their prisoners of war to Mars as the best means of placating him. Procopius similarly relates of the Scandinavians in the 6th century that they regarded human victims as the best offering. They sacrificed them to Mars, or Ares, whom they regarded as the greatest god. The place of Tyr as war god must have decreased before the growing power of Odin. Yet, in the late Middle Ages, an Icelander could translate in Templo Martis, showing that Tyr's place had not been forgotten. It is also significant of the preeminence of Tiwaz that in inscriptions which give Roman equivalents of the three great Teutonic gods, Mars is often first. The Wessobrunner gloss, 8th century, which speaks of the Suabian descendants of the Semnons of that time, speaks of them as Kuari, or worshippers of Zu. In the region of this people, their chief town Augsburg was called Siasburg, or Zeus town. Another name or epithet of the god is seen in the Thinxus, Mars Thinxus, to whom Frisian soldiers from Twente, in the territory of the Salic Franks, dedicated altars with figures in relief. These were brought to light at Houstades on the line of Hadrian's Wall in 1883. The names of the two Alasiagae, Bede and Femelaine, are joined with that of Mars Thinxus. The god is represented as a warrior. At his right hand a swan or goose. Female figures, the Alasiagae, hover in the receding sides of the semicircular reliefs, with sword or staff in one hand and the wraith in the other. Thinxus is regarded as a name of Zu in his capacity as tutelary god of the thing or assembly, that is, the Frisian cohort regarded as a unit or thing. The same divine name appears in Dinsdag, Dingsdag, Tuesday. Thinxus has also been explained as meaning warrior. The explanations of the names and functions of the two goddesses are numerous. They may possibly be equivalents of Valkyries. In the Eddas, Tyr has a subordinate place, and, if he was once a heaven god, Odin had ousted him. He was called Odin's son, and even as war god he had fallen into the background through Odin's supremacy. Snorri says of him, "He is most daring and stout-hearted, and has chief authority over victory in battle. It is good that brave men should invoke him." A Tyr valiant man is one who surpasses others in stoutness of heart. Another proverbial saying, illustrating Tyr's wisdom, was to call the wisest man Tyr prudent. Tyr cannot be called a reconciler of men. Runes for victory were written on swords, Tyr being invoked in the process. Skaldic kennings for Tyr were god of battles, son of Odin, the one-handed god, and fosterer of the wolf. Famous chiefs were known as Tyr's offspring, and Tyr occurs in personal names and in place names. The myths told of Tyr are few in number. Loki's offspring, the Fenris wolf, was brought up by the Aesir, of whom Tyr alone ventured to give him meat. When the gods saw how he grew, and recalled the prophecies which told how the wolf would be their destruction, they resolved to bind him. 2 fetters in turn were tried, but these were broken into pieces. Then the gods sent to the dwarves, who made the fetter Gleipnir out of 6 things: the noise of a cat in walking, a woman's bed, the roots of a rock, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird, all non-existent things. The fetter was soft and smooth, yet strong and sure. The gods then held debate with the wolf about submitting to have this fetter put on him. He finally agreed, provided that one of them put his hand in his mouth. None of the Aesir was willing to part with a hand, until Tyr stretched out his and put it in the wolf's mouth. The more the monster lashed out, the firmer became the fetter, but Tyr's hand was bitten off. Then the wolf was chained to a great rock, and there he is bound until the doom of the gods. Much ingenuity has been expended in inventing explanations of this myth. Beyond suggesting that Tyr is in conflict with dark and demonic powers, it does not explain itself further. That Tyr, as god of war, should have lost a hand may reflect what often happened to warriors in battle. Similar myths are told of gods elsewhere. Example, the Irish Nuadu, whose hand, struck off by an opponent, was replaced by one of silver. Zeus, who lost his tendons. The Vedic Vespala, whose leg was cut off in battle and replaced by one of iron. When Tyr was present at Aegir's feast and spoke in defense of Frey, Loki bade him be silent, for he could never fashion friendship between men, and then taunted him with the loss of his hand. Tyr replied that it boded ill for Loki's wolf, now awaiting in chains the great battle. Loki retaliated by saying that Tyr's wife, mentioned for the first and only time, had a son by him, and that Tyr never got a penny in compensation for the wrong done to him. The Heimskvita, which tells how Thor and Tyr, at the latter's advice, sought the mighty cauldron of the giant Hymir, makes this giant father of Tyr by the white-eyebrowed one, with golden hair, who welcomes Tyr at Hymir's abode, and who may have been a goddess, not a giantess. A 900-headed giantess, also present, is Tyr's grandmother, whom he loathed. Hence, Tyr is called kinsman of giants. Tyr takes no part in the action, save that he twice tries to move the kettle, but cannot, and then, when Thor has raised it, returns with him to the Aesir. The meaning of this myth, as well as of Tyr's relationship to the giant Hymir, has been the occasion of much debate. While it is in keeping with mythology that an important god should be related to a giant, it is possible that Tyr in this poem means not the war god, but is used merely in the sense of the god. This god might be Loki, for at the end of the poem we hear that Thor on his return found his goats lame, and this was Loki's doing. Snorri gives an incident of the laming of Thor's goat in another connection, when he and Loki were on a journey. The only other reference to Tyr in the Eddas is the notice of his conflict with the dog Garm at the Doom of the Gods, when each slew the other. Chapter 7. The Vanir group. Njord. According to Snorri, Njord is the third of the Aesir, though not of their race, for he was reared in the land of the Vanir and given by them as a hostage to the Aesir. This agrees with other passages in Snorri and in the poetic Edda, where Njord appears among the Aesir. Example, at Aegir's banquet. It is based on passages in Vafthrudnismal and Lokasenna. In the former, Odin says, "Tell me, whence Njord came among the Aesir's sons? Over fanes and shrines he rules by hundreds, yet was not among the Aesir born." Vafthrudnir answers, "In Vanaheim wise powers created him, and to the gods a hostage gave. At the doom of the gods he will return to the wise Vanir." In the latter, Loki addresses Njord and tells him that he was sent eastward and given to the gods as a hostage. Hence, he is god of the Vanir, kinsman of the Vanir, or simply, the Van. His dwelling is in Noatun, ship place, or heaven. There Njord built himself the high hall, where the faultless ruler of men sits in his high-timbered fane. Njord's wife is Skadi, daughter of the giant Thjazi, but apparently, before he came among the Aesir, he had 2 children by his unnamed sister, Frey and Freya. With this, Loki taunted him at Aegir's banquet. "I will no longer keep secret what I heard. With thy sister thou hadst a son, hardly worse than thyself." Njord rules the course of the wind and stills the sea, storm, and fire. Men call on him in seafaring and hunting. So rich and abundant in goods is he, that he can give plenty of lands or gear. Hence, men invoke him for such things. Thus, he is god of wealth bestowal, and, according to Vafthrudnismal, he is rich in altars and shrines. Njord has thus 2 distinct divine attributes. He is a sea god and a god of wealth and prosperity, a sea god of riches. His sister wife was perhaps the goddess Nerthus, of whom Tacitus speaks as worshipped by 7 tribes in northeast Germany, and whose name exactly corresponds to that of Njord, from Nerthus. Goethe says, "The general German word Nerthu, or goodwill, as a name denoting character, was extended to persons. Nerthus means the beneficent, friendly divinity, and may thus be used either of a god or a goddess." Tacitus says of Nerthus, "The Rhodingi, Aviones, Angli, Varini, Eudoses, Suardones, Noithons, tribes of the Ingevons, unite in worshipping Nerthus, that is Mother Earth, and think that she mingles in the affairs of men and visits the nations. There is a sacred grove on an island in the ocean, probably Sealand, and in it stands a wagon covered with a cloth. The priest alone may touch it. He becomes aware of the presence of the goddess in the innermost place, and follows her with the greatest reverence as she is drawn about by cows. Then are there joyful days, places of festivity, wheresoever the goddess comes as a guest. They do not engage in wars nor take up arms. Weapons are closed. Peace and quiet alone are then named and loved, until the same priest restores to her temple the goddess, satisfied with the intercourse of mortals. Thereupon, the vehicle and its covering, and, If it be credible, the goddess are washed in a secret lake. Slaves do this service, and the lake immediately swallows them up. All this suggests rites of fertility and a festival which would most naturally occur in spring. Nerthus is akin to Njord in functions, though different in sex. In spite of Tacitus's assertions, some, like Mannhardt, think that Nerthus was a male divinity. Others, example, A. Koch, that Njord, a male god, had taken the place of a female. But it is quite possible that a pair of deities, regarded as brother and sister, and bearing similar names, were worshipped together, along with a third, their son Frey, part of whose ritual, as we shall see, resembled that of Nerthus. Another theory is that originally Njord was a goddess, Nerthus, not a god, and that Skadi, regarded as a female in the Eddas, was a god. From sea land, where it was indigenous, this cult passed to Sweden and Norway, and there, apart from the witness of the Eddas, many places bear the name of Njord, showing that his cult was widespread. Thence the cult passed to Iceland. In literary sources, Njord and Frey are constantly mentioned together. So help me Frey and Njord and Thor. Together they dispense riches, hence an old Icelandic phrase, as rich as Njord. In an interesting myth, Snorri makes Skadi the wife of Njord. The giant Thjazi had been slain by the Aesir, and in panoply of war his daughter Skadi went to Asgard to avenge him. The Aesir offered her atonement, that is, to choose a husband from their number, but to choose him by the feet only, for she would see no more than these in making her selection. Her choice fell on him, whom she thought to be Balder, but the chosen one was Njord. In the bond of reconciliation, it was also agreed that the gods must make her laugh, which she deemed impossible. Loki accomplished this, however, by an act which suggests cruelty and obscenity rather than humor. In Saxo's account of the mythic Hadding, an incident resembling this method of choice occurs. A giant had taken in troth Ragnhild, daughter of Hakon, king of the Nitheri. Hadding overcame him, but was wounded. Ragnhild tended him, not knowing who he was, and, in order not to forget him, enclosed a ring in his wand. At a later time, her father gave her permission to choose a husband, and when the suitors were assembled, she felt their bodies and recognized Hadding by means of the ring. The identification motive in Saxo is a form of a folk tale formula, but the naked foot incident of the Edda has been connected with marriage rites in which only the foot of the future spouse is seen, and with fertility rites in which bare feet play a part. Schroeder thinks that Nerthus Njord is to be explained as dancer, of Sanskrit narth, to dance, and that the priest and priestess who represented this pair of fertility deities carried out the ritual with bare feet. Skadi wished to dwell in her father's abode in the mountains, Thrymheim, home of noise, of which Grimnismal says that here Thjazi, the all-powerful Jotun, dwelt, but Skadi, bright bride of the gods, now inhabits the old dwelling of her father. Njord wished to dwell near the sea. They made a compact to dwell 9 nights in Thrymheim and 3 at Noatun. When Njord came back from the mountains to Noatun, he sang, I loved not the mountains, I dwelt not long in them, 9 nights only. Sweeter is to me the song of the swan than the wild wolf's howl. To this Skadi replied, My sleep was troubled on the shore of the sea by the screaming of sea birds. Every morning the sea mew wakens me, returning from the deep. These verses, quoted by Snorri, are from a lost Eddic poem. Skadi then went up to the mountains and dwelt in Thrymheim. She goes on snowshoes and shoots wild creatures with her bow and arrows. Hence, she is called Goddess, or Lady of the Snowshoes. Skadi's departure from Njord is referred to by the skald Thjord Skjargesen, who speaks of her grieving at the van's side. Saxo relates a similar story of Hadding and Ragnhild, quoting in Latin verses which correspond to those cited by Snorri. After years spent in disuse of arms, Hadding reproached himself with dwelling in the hills and not following seafaring. The cry of the wolves, the howl of beasts, keep him from sleep. The ridges and hills are dreary to one who loves the sea. Far better to ply the oar and revel in sea fights than to dwell in rough lands, winding woodlands, and barren glades. Ragnhild sang of the shrill bird vexing her as she stayed by the sea, and the noise of the sea mew keeping her from sleep. Safer and sweeter is the enjoyment of the woods. Hence it has been supposed that Hadding is identical with Njord, or his rebirth, but it is likely that Saxo merely transferred the Eddic poem to the story of Hadding. In spite of Skadi's separation from Njord, as told by Snorri, she appears with him at Aegir's banquet in Lokasenna, and also in the introduction to Skirnismal. In the former poem, she tells Loki how he will be punished, that is, by being bound by the gods on the rocks with bowels torn from his ice-cold son. Loki replies that he was first and last at the fight when her father was slain. Skadi says that even so, from her dwellings and fields shall ever come forth cold counsels for him. Loki then reminds her that she spoke more mildly when she invited him to her bed. Snorri connects Skadi with the myth of Loki's punishment. She fastened a venomous serpent above him, where he was bound, and its poison dropped on his face. The explanation given by some scholars of the 9-night stay in Thrymheim and 3 at Noatun is that nights signifies months, and that the sea in the extreme north is open for 3 months for shipfaring. For the other 9, it is sealed by ice and winter storms. Snorri's Heimskringla, following the Jungerlingatal, gives a different version of this myth. Njord wedded a woman Skadi, but she would have nothing of him, and hence was wedded to Odin, and had to him many sons, one of whom was Soiming. A poem by Eyvind is cited in support of this, which says that Soiming was begotten by Odin on a giant maiden when they dwelt in Mannheim. To Soiming, Norway traced a line of kings, or more strictly speaking, the rulers of Helgoland. The theory of alternating twin gods sharing one mate has been applied here, but Skadi is regarded as the god and Njord the goddess, shared by Odin and Skadi. Skadi has been held to be a representative of the Finns and Lapps who peopled the north of Norway. She may have been one of their goddesses, regarded as a giant's daughter, because the inhospitable northern region was akin to or identical with Jotunheim. How she came to be associated with Njord and Odin is far from clear. But a cult war may have been considered mythically as a war of Scandinavian and Finnish deities, ending in a pact and marriage. R. M. Mayer sees in the disputed residence incident of Skadi and Njord an iconic myth, that is, a myth based on the history of an image of Skadi which had been carried off to Noatun, and, after a war, shared a residence with Norsemen and Finns. The euhemeristic notices of Njord in the Jungerlinga saga confirm the Eddic account of him as a god of prosperity. He became ruler after Odin's death. The Swedes call him Nord, and he took tribute of them. In his days there was peace, and hence the Swedes thought that he swayed the year's plenty and men's prosperity. He died in his bed, and was marked for Odin ere he died. The cult of Njord was associated with that of Frey, for the two deities are mentioned together both in taking oaths and in drinking toasts at feasts. First came Odin's toast for victory and power, second Njord's, and third Frey's for good seasons and peace. Egil speaks of Njord and Frey as wealth givers, and prays that both gods may be angry with King Eirik. Little light, however, is thrown upon the personality of this god as a figure of popular worship and esteem, beyond the reference to his many shrines in Vafthrudnismal. We may suppose that this god of earth's fruitfulness and of prosperity, when his cult passed among seafarers and fishermen, became also a god of the riches of the sea. Chapter 8. The Vanir Group. Frey. Frey, or Freyr, son of Njord, probably by his sister, is like him one of the Vanir, but reckoned among the Aesir. He is the bold son of Njord, his mighty son, his noble son. Among the Aesir he is the most renowned, foremost of the gods, whom no man hateth, the first of all the heroes in the god's house. His name, which corresponds to Gothic Frauja, Fro, Freya, means Lord, and was thus at first a title. Snorri says of him that, like his sister Freya, he is fair of face and mighty. He rules over rain and sunshine, and also over the increase of the earth. Good is it to call on him for fruitful seasons and peace, for he can give peace and prosperity to men. He is God of the fruitful season and of the gifts of wealth. Thus, Frey is closely akin to Njord in his functions. It is also said of him that he harms not maids, nor men's wives, and frees the bound from their fetters. He is also the battle-bold Frey. Frey's seat is in Alfheim, the land of the Alfa or elves, given him by the gods as a tooth gift in ancient times, that is, a present to a child on cutting its first tooth. As the elves are especially connected with the furthering of vegetable life, the places on the turf where they have danced betray themselves by the richness of the grass. So the god of fruitfulness is naturally their overlord. His possessions are Skidbladnir, swiftest and best of ships, and made with great skill of craftsmanship by dwarves. It was given to Frey, perhaps because he, one of the Vanir, had to do with shipfaring. It is the ideal magic ship, so large that all the gods may man it with their weapons and armaments. As soon as its sails are hoisted, whether it is going, it has a fair wind, like certain ships in the sagas. When not in use, it can be folded up and put in the pouch. Possibly the ship betokens the clouds. Frey's sword fights of itself, or if a worthy hero wills it. His horse, Bloduhofi, can go through the dark and flickering flames. To him also is ascribed the ring Dropnir, which multiplies itself, a symbol of fertility appropriate to Frey. His chariot, in which he drives at Baldur's funeral, is drawn by the boar Gulinbursti, or gold bristles, or Slidrugdani, a fearful tusk, or according to the Hustdrapa of Ulf Ugason, Frey rode on the boar itself. This boar was made by dwarves and could run through air and water better than any horse. The glow from its mane and bristles was so great that wherever the boar was, no matter how dark the night, there would be sufficient light. It is also called Hildisvini, or battle swine, which shines with bristles of gold. Frey's boar is undoubtedly connected with the offering to him of boars in sacrifice. especially the Sonargolter, atonement boar, on the eve of the Yule festival. The largest boar was given to Frey, and it was so holy that when it was led into the hall, oaths were sworn and vows made while the hand was laid over its bristles. The purpose of the sacrifice was to cause the god to be favorable with the new year. According to the Hervarar saga, King Heidrek offered the boar to Frey, but an earlier reference does not connect the Sonargolder with Frey. A survival of the sacrifice is found in the cakes baked in Sweden at Yule in the form of a boar. Whether all the references to the boar in Teutonic folk custom or story collected by Grimm are connected with the cult of Frey is doubtful. The ceremonial bringing in of a boar's head at Christmas banquets in England, still surviving at Queen's College, Oxford, cannot be definitely shown to point to a cult of Frey among the Saxons. According to Tacitus, the Aesti worshipped the Mater Deum, and wore as an emblem of that superstition the forms of bows, which took the place of arms or other protection and guaranteed victory. Some have seen in this native goddess Freya, who, in Yndlol rides a boar with golden bristles. The custom of wearing a boar's image or helmets in that form as protectives was common among the Anglo-Saxons, as their poetry shows, as well as in Germany. It need not necessarily point to a cult of Frey, but to a wider belief in the swine as a sacred or magic animal. Frey's servants are Skirnin, prominent in Skirnismal, and Bugvir and his wife Bela, both of whom opposed Loki at Aegir's banquet and were addressed contemptuously by him. At the doom of the gods, Frey contends with Surt and falls, because he lacks his sword, which he had given to Skirnir. Reference is made to Frey's slaying of Beli, not with his sword, but with his fist or the horn of a hart. Hence he is called adversary of Beli, Beli's hater, or fair slayer. Beli may be the brother of Gerd, of whom Frey was enamored, for she speaks of him as a brother's murderer. Like Njord, Frey is accused by Loki of having a sister wife, Freya, the only reference to this save in the Ynglinga saga. Both Skirnismal and Snorri give the story of his love for the giant's daughter Gerd, called his wife in Yndlol. Gerd, Frey's spouse, was Gymir's daughter. Orboda bore her to the old giant. Orboda was one of the hill giants' race. Snorri calls Gymir a man, but he was certainly a giant. His daughter was fairest of women. One day Frey sat himself on Hildskjalf and looked over the worlds, even to Jotunheim, where he saw a woman raising her hands to open the door of a house. Brightness gleamed from her arms over sea, sky, and all worlds. Frey was filled with melancholy, represented by Snorri as a punishment for sitting in Odin's seat. But in Skirnismal there is no word of this, and perhaps the seat was Frey's originally, not Odin's. Skadi, or Njord, according to an emendation of the text and also in Snorri's version, sent for Skirnir and bade him ask Frey, for whose sake he was so melancholy. Skirnir feared that he would get evil answers from him, but he questioned him boldly and learned the cause. He was deeply in love with Gerd, yet none of the Aesir or Alfar will grant that we may live together. He asked Skirnir to go and woo her for him and bring her to him. Skirnir asked for Frey's horse and magic sword, and with these set off. He spoke to the horse, saying that it was dark and now it was time to travel across the wild fells, over the giant's land. Either they would return together, or the powerful giant would take them. Then he reached Jotunheim and Gymir's dwelling, guarded by dogs. On a hill sat a herdsman who, when Skirnir asked for speech with Gerd, said that this could never be. Meanwhile, within the dwelling Gerd heard a noise, and learned from her servant that a man had dismounted at the gate. She bade the servant bring him in, though she feared that he was her brother's slayer. When he entered, she asked him if he was the one of the Alfar, of the Aesir's sons, or of the wise Vanir, since he had come through the flickering flame to her abode. He said that he was none of these, and offered her golden apples if she would say that Frey was dearest to her. She refused them, saying that she would never be Frey's. He offered her the ring Draupnir. This also she refused. Then he threatened to behead her, but she was unmoved and told him that he might fight Gymir if he liked. Skirnir replied that the sword would kill her father, and threatened her with the magic power of his staff and with curses. She will go where men will never more see her. On the Eagle's Hill she will sit, facing hell, and her meat will be loathsome to her. Even the frost giant Hrimnir will stare at her, and she will become better known than Heimdall. Grief and terror will afflict her in the giant's land, and she will dwell with the three-headed giant. Odin is angry with her. Frey will hate her. The god's wrath will be upon her. Skirnir bade all Jotuns, all frost giants, the sons of Suttung, and the Aesir hear how he forbade her ever to know the joy of love. Hrimgrimnir is the giant who will have her beneath near the doors of hell, and to the frost giant's halls she will daily crawl in misery. Then he wrote 4 runes, by which she would know unquenched desire, though he would cut them out again if she relented. As a result of these curses, Gerd yielded, though she said that she had never thought to love one of the Vanir. She bade Skirnir tell Frey to meet her 9 nights hence in the secret wold called Barri, where she will be his. On hearing this from Skirnir, Frey said, "1 night is long, 2 are longer. How can I bear 3? Often has a month seemed less to me than half a night of longing now." Gerd is included among the Asunjur by Snorri, and Loki taunts Frey at Aegir's banquet with buying her with gold, selling his sword at the same time. Hence, when Muspel's sons come riding, he will have no sword. The flickering flame, Vafrolgi, by which Gerd's abode is surrendered, is a magic defense against intrusion, and only by magic or supernatural means can a hero go through it. It is found thrice in the Eddic poems. The second reference to it is in Svipdagsmal, where it surrounds the hall where Menglod is secured. Svipdag makes his way through it to her, his destined bride. The third reference is in Sigurdrifumal, where Brynhild is held in a magic sleep imposed by Odin, in a hall on a mountain surrounded by fire. Through it Sigurd makes his way. Frey was sometimes called Yngvi Frey or Ingunnar Frey, a name connected with that of Ingu, the tribal ancestor or eponymous hero of the Yngvianos, the group of tribes dwelling in Schleswig-Holstein, from whom sprang the Saxons, Anglo-Saxons, and Frisians. Ingunnar is either a distorted form of Yngvi or the genitive of a feminine Ingun, possibly Frey's unnamed mother or his consort. The name would mean Frey of Ingun or Lord or husband of Ingun. The younglings, the earliest race of the kings of Sweden, regarded themselves as descendants of Frey, called Yngvi in the Ynglinga saga. They were kindred of the god Frey, or held him to be the founder of their race, says Saxo, speaking of Swedish heroes. Yngvi's people were the Swedes. There are, however, two genealogies. One is that of the saga, which begins with Njord, then Frey or Yngvi. The other is that of the Islandiga book, which begins with Yngvi, who is followed by Njord, Frey, etc. Whether Yngvi and Frey were actually different mythic personages, and if so, why they became merged in each other, cannot be determined. Perhaps the connection lay in the fact that the king of the Ingwines or East Danes was called Freya Ingwina. Their tribal ancestor was Ing. Ing first dealt with the East Danes and then crossed the sea, his wagon following him. Ing is the same as Yngvi, and as Frey means lord, Yngvi may have been the personal name of the god. The Ingvinos of Tacitus, who dwelt in the coast region between the North Sea and the Baltic, are to be traced back to Yngvi or Frey, their tribal deity. Their region was also the seat of the Nerthus cult. Thus, the cult of Yngvi Frey passed thence to Sweden, where its chief seat was Uppsala. In his account of the Hadding saga, Saxo says that this mythic hero was attacked on one occasion by a sea monster, which he slew. But as he was exulting in his deed, a woman appeared who said that he would suffer the wrath of the gods, for his sacrilegious hands had slain one of them in disguised form. So Hadding, slayer of a benignant god, in order to appease the deities, sacrificed dusky victims to Frey at an annual feast, which he left posterity to follow. This rite was called by the Swedes Froblot, sacrifice to Frey. Saxo also says that Frey, satrap of the gods, took up his abode not far from Uppsala, where he exchanged for a ghastly and infamous sin offering the old custom of prayer by sacrifice which had been used for many generations. He paid to the gods abominable offerings by beginning to sacrifice human victims. The Hakonar saga also says that Frey raised a great temple at Uppsala and set his capital there, endowing it with all his revenues, lands, and movables. The Ynglinga saga calls Frey a rich and generous lord under whom peace and fruitfulness abounded. He took the realm after Njord and was lord of the Swedes. The peace of Frodi began in his time, and good years in all lands, which the Swedes ascribed to Frey. He raised a temple at Uppsala and was held dearer than the other gods, because the people were wealthier in his days. Gerda was his wife, and he was called Yngvi, and his kindred were the younglings. When he died, he was put in a barrow with a door and 3 windows, and the Swedes were told that he was still alive. He was guarded there for 3 winters, and gold was put through one of the windows, silver through the second, and copper through the third. Peace reigned during these 3 years. When at last the Swedes learned that he was dead, they would not burn him, but called him God of the world, and sacrificed to him for plenteous years, thinking that while his body was in Sweden, peace and plenty would abound. The peace of Frodi is often spoken of in northern literature. Frodi was an early Danish king, more mythical than real, and in his time this peace began, a kind of golden age. Snorri says that during it no man injured another, even if that other were his brother's or father's slayer. No thief or robber was known, and a gold ring lay long untouched on Yalang's health. This was at the time when Augustus reigned at Rome. The peace came to an end when 2 giant maids, Fenya and Menya, ground out a magic mill, a host against Frodi, who was slain. They did this because he forced them to grind out gold. This myth of a golden age was doubtless connected with the cult and person of Frey, whose name is to be found in that of Snorri's King Frodi and the several kings of that name in Saxo. Behind all these euhemeristic notices of Frey lies the evidence that his cult had been carried into Sweden from elsewhere, and that there this god, who is said to have himself introduced the cult and arranged the sacrifices, had a prominent place. He was called Blotgud Svea, the sacrificial god of Sweden, and Svea god, god of the Swedes. It is clear also that Frey was regarded as a god of fertility, and that human sacrifices were offered in his cult. As in other fertility cults, that of Frey was connected with generation. Adam of Bremen says that at Uppsala, the image of Fricko or Frey, who bestowed peace and joy on men, stood beside those of Odin and Thor, and was invested with Ingenti Priapo, an obvious symbol of the god's influence on fertility. He also says that at the 9 Years festival, unseemly songs were sung during the sacrifices. We do not know that this was a Frey festival, but if so, the notice would correspond to what Saxo says of the sacrifices at Uppsala, that Starkad, who had lived for 7 years with the sons of Frey, left that place because he was so disgusted with the effeminate gestures, the play of the mimes, and the ringing of bells. Saxo also declares that the legendary Fro, king of Sweden, put the wives of Sigurd's kinsfolk in a brothel and delivered them to public outrage. If Fro is Frey, this might be a memory of the erotic aspects of his cult. The only myth of Frey reported in the Eddas, his lovesickness for Gerd and his strong desire for her, points to the nature of his personality and worship. Frey's image was taken in a wagon through the land at the close of winter, under the care of a priestess, who was regarded as his wife and was set over his sacred place. From Uppsala, the procession traversed the land, and was everywhere received with joy and with sacrifices, in expectation of a fruitful year. A curious story is told of this in the Olaf saga Tryggvasonar by a Christian sagaman. Gunnar Helming had fled from Norway to escape the consequences of a suspected crime. In those days, there were great sacrifices to the gods, and Frey had long received more than the others. His image was so enchanted that he used to speak to the people out of it. Gunnar, having come to Sweden, placed himself under Frey's protection. The priestess received him, though the god did not seem favourable to him, and, at the time of the procession, she bade Gunnar come and feast with Frey and her. Gunnar went with the servants of the god, who abandoned the wagon during a snowstorm in the hills. Gunnar led it, but, feeling tired, climbed into it. After a time, the priestess bade him go and lead the wagon, for Frey was against him. He obeyed, but soon after resumed his seat, saying that he would risk standing up against Frey if he opposed him. He wrestled with the god, and, being nearly overcome, he thought that if he conquered, he would return to Norway and accept the Christian faith. The evil spirit, which according to the narrative was in the image, now abandoned it. Gunnar broke the image and himself personated the god. At the place where a feast was prepared in expectation of the visit, the people marvelled that the god and his priestess should have come through the storm, still more that he should come among them and drink like men. The time was spent in feasting, but the counterfeit Frey would accept no offerings save those of gold, silver, and fine garments. In time, the priestess became pregnant, and this, with the fine weather, was regarded as a good omen for a fruitful year. The news of the power of the Swedish god spread far and wide. King Olaf of Norway heard of it, and, suspecting the truth, sent Gunnar's brother to Sweden. He found Gunnar, who, with priestess and treasure, returned to Norway and was baptized. The resemblance of this procession to that of Nerthus and a priest, as recorded 8 centuries before by Tacitus, is striking, and suggests the connection of Frey and Nerthus as deities of fertility, Nerthus perhaps being wife or mother of Frey. Not improbably, priest and goddess, or god and priestess, were believed to celebrate the sacred marriage during this festival time in order to promote fertility. In the Nerthus rite, a woman would represent the goddess. In the Frey rite, a man would represent the god. In the story, Gunnar acts as the god and as husband of the priestess. The story would thus be reminiscent of actual custom, with priest and priestess as god and goddess. Evidence of such a ritual in prehistoric times in Norway has been collected by Professor Magnus Olsen, the rite surviving in folk custom and being represented on engraved gold plates which had been buried in the earth. Such a ritual may lie behind the story in Skirnismal. Skirnir is by some regarded as merely Frey himself, whether or not he is to be taken as the surviving memory of the mortal who took the part of the god in the folk drama, the god himself being also represented by an effigy for which the role of Gerd Seeker was too active. Frey's priestess is called a temple priestess, but he had also priests. Like Njord, Frey was besought to give fair winds to voyagers, and he was frequently named with him and with Thor. Example, in taking an oath. So help me Frey, Njord, and the Almighty God, Thor. Frey was thus a god of many functions: light, sunshine, fertility, fruitfulness, and fair winds. Sagas speak of sacrifices of bulls to Frey. Libations were also offered or toasts drunk to him along with those to other gods, Odin or Thor. And Njord, Frey's, and Njord's being for fruitful seasons and peace. Thorkel, who had been driven out by Glum, went to Frey's temple at Eyjafjord in Iceland with a full-grown ox, saying to the god that he had long been his chief toast and had many gifts from him, and that he had repaid them well. Now he gave Frey the ox, asking him to drive out Glum and desiring a token of acceptance of the gift. The ox bellowed and fell dead, and this was regarded by Thorkel as a good sign. Some time after, Glum dreamed that a great company came to see Frey, and it seemed to him that he saw the gods sitting in their midst. Glum asked the company who they were, and learned that they were his dead kinsmen who were praying to Frey that Glum should not be driven out. Their prayer did not prevail, for Frey was answering them shortly and angrily, and was mindful of Thorkel's gift. Glum was never Frey's good friend after that. Not only were there large images of Frey, smaller ones were used as amulets. Heid the Volva prophesied to Ingimund about his settlement in an undiscovered western land. He said that he would not go, but she declared that he would, and, as a token, his silver image of Frey would be lost out of his purse and found when he dug a place in that land for his high-seat pillars. The image was discovered to be missing, and Ingimund sent 2 Finns to Iceland to discover it. They found it, but could not remove it, for it went from one place to another, and they could not take it. So Ingimund was forced to go himself, and when he had set up his pillars, he found the image. It had belonged to a petty Norse king, and had been given to Ingimund by King Harald about 872 AD. Sacred horses were kept in Frey's temple at Trondheim, and a curious story is told of a horse, a half-share of which was dedicated to Frey by its owner, Hrafnkell, who migrated to Iceland in the time of Harald. He revered no god more than Frey and dedicated a temple to him. Hence he was called Frey's priest, Frey's Godi. He vowed to slay anyone who rode this horse. In order to look for sheep, his shepherd Einar mounted it, and by its loud gnawings this was made known to Hrafnkel, who slew Einar. The result was a feud between Einar's people and Hrafnkel, who was banished. His enemies cast the horse, whose name was Freyfaxi, into a stream from a cliff, afterwards known as Freyfaxi's Cliff. They burned the temple and robbed the images of their decorations. On hearing this, Hrafnkel said, "I think it folly to believe in the gods," and from that day forward offered no sacrifices. We hear of another horse with a white mane called Freyfaxi, belonging to Brand. It was a splendid horse for fighting, and men believed that Brand put his trust in it and worshipped it. Hence, he was known as Faxabrand. The cult of Frey seems to have passed from Sweden, with its centre at Uppsala, to Norway. There was an important temple of the god at Trondheim, where the people prayed to him for peace and fruitfulness, and looked for announcements about future events from him. When King Olaf commanded the people at Trondheim in 998 AD to break Frey's image, they refused on the ground that they had served him long, and that he had done well by them, giving them peace and plenty and revealing the future to them. From Norway, Frey's cult passed to Iceland with the emigrants in the 9th century, and there they placed themselves under his protection and that of Thor. The story of Ingimund offers an interesting illustration of this, and of the god's desire for the spread of his cult, which was strongest in the north of the island. Many temples of Frey are mentioned in the sagas, some of them peculiarly sacred. In Vigga Glum's saga, it is told that Glum harbored outlaws at Frey's temple at Eyjafjord. This made the god angry. He withdrew his protection from Glum, and now his luck turned. Not only did groups of men or peoples trace descent from Frey, calling themselves his kin or his offspring, but individuals regarded themselves as his friends, or they were dear to him. The Gisla saga tells how no snow lodged on the south side of Thorgrim's Barrow, in the northwest of Iceland, nor did it freeze there. So men guessed that this was because Thorgrim had been so dear to Frey that he would not suffer the snow to come between them. Or, as Gisli said, Frey warms his servant's grave. Before his death, it was said of Thorgrim that he had intended to hold a festival at the beginning of winter, to greet the winter and to sacrifice to Frey. Frey's high position is seen in his epithets: Veralder God, God of the world, Folkvaldi God, foremost of the gods. His occupancy of Lidskjalf in Skirnismal and his possession of the ring Draupnir, elsewhere ascribed to Odin, point to a time when Odin had not yet taken a high place than Frey in Scandinavia. Chapter 9. The Vanir Group. Freya. Freya, or the Lady, as daughter of Njord and sister of Frey, was one of the Vanir, and was called Vana Brudur, bride of the Vanir, Vanadis, lady of the Vanir, and Vana God, Vanir goddess. Like the other members of the group, she is reckoned among the Aesir, and is the most renowned of the goddesses and most gently born. In heaven she has the dwelling Folkvang, folk plain, and her hall, great and fair, is Sesrumnir, rich in seats. Here she assigns seats to the heroes who fall in battle, for half of these she shares with Odin. Hence she is the possessor of the slain. She drives forth in a chariot drawn by cats, and in this manner she came to Baldur's funeral. Her most famous possession is the necklace Brisingamen, which Loki stole and Heimdall recovered. She has also a hawk's plumage of feather dress, which enables her to fly, and is sometimes borrowed by Loki. She rides the boar Hildisvini, battle swine, with golden bristles, which she desires to pass off as Frey's boar. In reality, it is her lover Ottar in that form. Freya's husband is Odd, hence she is Oddsmeyr, bride of Odd. Their daughter is Nos, jewel, so fair that precious things are called after her, Nosir. According to the Ynglinga saga, she had two daughters, Ross and Gersimi, after whom all things dearest to have are named. Freya is willing to help when men call upon her, especially in love affairs, and she is thus called Goddess of Love. Songs of love were a delight to her. In the euhemerized account of Freya in the Ynglinga saga, she is said to have introduced evil magic, Seidr, among the Aesir, its use being already common among the Vanir, perhaps a memory of the use of magic in her cult. From her name, noble women had the name of honor Freyjur. Freya is known only in Norway and mainly in Icelandic poetry. Hence it has been asserted that she was a creation of the Skalds as a counterpart to Frey. This is unlikely, and she is one of the few goddesses whose cult is definitely mentioned in northern literature. In Odrunar Glatter, one of the heroic poems of the Edda, occurs the following appeal. So may the holy powers grant thee help, Frigg and Freya and full many gods, as thou hast saved me from fear and misery. And in Hyndluljod, Freya says of Ottar that he had made her a horg, a cairn of altar piled up with stones, which the sacrificial fires had fused into glass, and that it was often reddened with the blood of animal victims, for Ottar trusted in the goddesses. To Freya, with Thor, Odin, and the Aesir, peasants of Trondheim offered toasts at the beginning of winter in their feasts and sacrifices. In the Half's saga, she is called upon for aid. King Alfric determined to keep that one of his two wives, Signy and Geirhild, who should brew the best beer. Signy asked Freya's aid, Geirhild that of Odin. Hot, he with the hat. He gave her his spittle in place of yeast, so her beer was the best. For this, she had to give Odin her son Vikar. If, however, Freya was an independent goddess, there seems to have been frequent confusion between her and Frigg, Odin's consort, or perhaps she tended to take the place of Frigg. When she is said to share the slain with Odin, one would naturally suppose that this would have been Frigg's privilege. In the Egil saga, it is women whom Freya receives after death. Both goddesses possess hawk's plumage, and Loki borrows it from both. Some have held that the famous Brisingamen was originally Frigg's possession. In later poetry, Freya is actually called Flonir's, or Odin's wife, as Frigg was. The Christian Hjalti Skegjason was outlawed at the Thing in Iceland in 999 AD because of his blasphemous verses against Odin and Freya. Ever will I gods blaspheme. Freya methinks a bitch does seem. Freya a bitch? Aye, let them be, both dogs together, Odin and she. Suggests that she was regarded as Odin's consort, taking the place of Frigg. Freya and Frigg may have both been developed out of one original goddess, spouse of the old heaven god, to be ultimately confused with each other when the cult of Odin was increasing in the north. On the other hand, that Freya could be held to share the slain with Odin suggests her lofty position. Her abode is depicted as a kind of Valhall, and it might be identified with Vingolf, a seat of goddesses and also of the slain. Freya might also be regarded as chief of the Valkyries, riding forth to the strife, as Snorri depicts her. Wheresoever she rides forth to the battle, she has half of the slain. And, in this light, her fearless pouring out of ale for the giant Rungnir when he invaded Asgard would be significant, for the Valkyries poured out liquor in Valhall for heroes. As chief of the Valkyries, she would have an interest in the slain. If the names of her abodes have reference to their being abodes of the dead, folk plain, and rich in seats, then a wider conception of a rule over the dead might be indicated. The passage in Egil's saga points to this. Thorgerd, daughter of Egil, who intends to die with her father, says that she has taken no food and will take none, for she hopes to feast that night with Freya, just as heroes hope to be Odin's guests. But there may be a survival in this passage of an older belief that women, not heroes, went to her abode at death. The myths about Freya are to some extent in keeping with her position as goddess of love, possibly also of fertility. Some of them suggest her desirableness as a beautiful and voluptuous goddess. She is coveted by giants, by him who rebuilt the citadel of the Aesir, by Rungnir, and by Thrym. When Thrym sought her as his bride, her indignation was intense, her anger shook the dwelling of the gods, and her necklace broke on her heaving bosom. Maddest for men might I be called, did I travel with thee to Jotunheim. These giants, representing the power of winter, might be regarded as trying to overcome a goddess of fertility. Similarly, she was forced by 4 dwarfs to surrender herself to them ere they would give her Brisinga men. This is the subject of a story in the Sorlathatr, 14th century. Freya is here Odin's mistress. One day, looking into the rock dwelling of 4 dwarves, she saw them fashioning a wonderful necklace. Offering to purchase it, she was told that she would have it only if she yielded herself to the dwarves. To this she submitted and became possessor of the famous necklace Brisinga men. Loki heard of this and told Odin, who bade him get the necklace, a difficult task, for no one could enter Freya's abode without her consent. Loki transformed himself into a fly and sought some opening, but in vain. At last he crept through a tiny hole in the roof. The inmates of the hall were asleep, Freya lying with the clasp of the necklace under her neck. Transformed now into a flea, Loki bit her cheek. She woke and turned over on her other side. Then, assuming his own form, Loki unclasped the necklace, opened the door, and went with it to Odin. Freya regained it from Odin only by consenting to incite 2 mighty kings, Hedin and Hilde, to an unending conflict. This story is probably based on an earlier poem now lost. In the Eddas, Freya is the possessor of the necklace, and it so distinguishes her that when Thor disguised himself as the goddess, he wore this necklace. On another occasion, or in another myth, the necklace stolen by Loki was recovered by Heimdall. This necklace, the necklace of the Brisings, who must be its artificers, or of Brising, is alluded to as the Brisinga Mene in Beowulf, carried off by Hama from Eormanrik. Here it forms part of a hoard. The necklace itself is explained by modern mythologists as the rainbow, the moon, the morning or evening star, the red dawn, etc. Some have regarded it as the sun setting in the sea, and of which Freya, regarded as the heaven goddess, is thus dispossessed. The word has also been connected with brisingr, or fire, a name still given to bonfires in Norway, an allusion to its gleaming quality, the jewel which sparkles like fire. Menglod, necklace glad, whom the hero Svipdag is compelled to seek by his stepmother, is so called after this mythic ornament, and is thus held to be a form of Freya. Svipdag called up his dead mother Groa from the grave, and was given by her several charms to guard him in his difficult quest. He reached the Hall of the Giants, surrounded by fire, where Menglod was. The giant Fjolsvid sat before it, and held parley with Svipdag. In the course of their dialogue, much mythic information is given. At last the giant says that no one is destined to have Menglod save Svipdag, who now reveals himself and is welcomed by her as bridegroom. The evidence that Menglod is a form of Freya is slender, and the tale rather suggests a folk story than a myth. Attempts to explain the necklace in terms of natural phenomena are unsatisfactory, and it seems better to regard it as the reflection in the divine sphere of such a precious human possession as a valuable necklace. Freya's lubricity is emphasized in the Eddas. In Lokasenna, Loki attacks her, in common with other goddesses, for lewdness. She had just repelled his slander of Frigg, when Loki says, "Be silent, Freya. Well I know thee. Thou art not free of faults. All the Aesir and Alfar who now are here, hast thou in turn made happy." Freya denies this, and, evil witch, is then charged by Loki with having been found in a brother's bed by the Aesir. When Loki says of Thor, disguised as Freya, that she has eaten nothing nor closed an eye for 8 nights, so hot is her desire for the giant's home, there may be a suggestion of Freya's character. In Yndlol Yod, Freya riding on a boar seeks the wise giantess Yndla in order to learn from her the story of her favorite Ottar's descent. She wishes Yndla to ride with her to Valhall on a wolf. Yndla knows her to be Freya, and says that the boar is her lover Ottar. After telling the story of his descent, Yndla dismisses Freya with the caustic words, "In the night time, like the she-goat Heidrun, thou leapest after the goats." She says also, "To Odd didst thou run, ever lusty, and many have stolen under thy girdle." And she frequently calls Ottar Freya's lover. Frey admits that the boar is Ottar and compels Yndla to bring him the memory beer, which will help him to recall the genealogy which she has just related. If Yndla does not swiftly bring it, she will raise flames around her and burn her alive. Yndla brings the drink, but mingled with the venom of an evil fate. Freya says that this malediction will work no ill. Ottar will find the delicious drink when she begs the favor of the gods. Perhaps we may assume that Freya causes the death of Yndla after having forced her to give the desired information. Thor is called Freya's friend in a poem by Eilif Gudrunarsson, and this may refer to some love affair with her. We should note also her association with Frey, a Priapic god of fertility, and the glossing of her name in Christian times as Venus. Odd, Freya's husband, was not a deity, but the man called Odd. He goes forth into far lands, but Freya remains behind in tears, and her tears are red gold. Freya has many names. Because she went among strange folk seeking Odd, she called herself by different names: Mardol, Horn, Geffen, Sur. In this passage, Snorri does not explain how Freya both remains at home and wanders in search of Odd. The account itself has given occasion to the most varied mythologizing interpretations, and, if it is based on natural phenomena, what these are cannot now be determined. With reference to her weeping, one of the goddess's titles is Gratfagra God, goddess beautiful in tears, and gold is called Tears of Freya. In folk tales, the gift of weeping tears which become pearls is a well-known incident, and tears of gold are wept by a maiden in an Icelandic story. Her name, Morthol, is a form of Mardol, and if the latter means shining over the sea, then she might be the sun goddess sinking to rest in the sea, the golden shimmer on the water suggesting her tears as gold. Others, like Gering, see in Freya the bestower of the fructifying summer rain. She hovers over the earth in a feathered race, the clouds. Hence, she is the goddess beautiful in tears. Her tears change to gold, the golden corn seeds. It should be noted that, as Odd leaves Freya, so Odin leaves Frigg in Saxo's story, another suggestion of the oneness of Freya and Frigg. To some degree, Freya is a counterpart of her brother Frey. Both are fair of face, both are deities of love, and that in its more sensual aspects. Both are associated with the boar on which they ride or are driven by it. If Nerthus was once of more importance than her male counterpart Njord, this was probably true also of Freya in comparison with Frey. We have seen that Frey's name, Ingunnar Frey, means Frey of Ingun, or Lord or Husband of Ingun. If Ingun here stands for Freya, this would mean that she had once been more prominent than her consort, an earlier fertility goddess, possibly a form of Mother Earth. Professor Shadwick has argued that the name Ljungvi was that not only of Frey, but of the members of the royal house at Uppsala. If these were regarded as representatives of Frey, they would each in turn be looked on as consorts of the goddess, and Frey himself may have been originally no more than their eponymous ancestor. These, however, are highly speculative suggestions.